I'm Anne with Loving Spoonful's Grow Project, back with another edition of our Grow Project at Home series. And today we are going to be exploring the wonders of worms. Earthworms are often called a gardener's best friend. Why do you think that is? Well, today we are going to get to know these little critters a bit better, and we are going to hopefully answer that question. And in the process, I am going to share with you 10 tremendous tidbits of information about earthworms. So let's see if we can find some. Good places to look for worms would be under wet objects like stones or logs or leaves. Or you can do what I did, leave a wet piece of cardboard overnight on the ground and see if they congregate there by morning. So let's see if we can find some. Well, that didn't take long. I'm so happy that there's some worms in our soil in the garden. I'm gonna pick one up to get a closer look. And if we're gonna touch worms, it's important to keep in mind not to have any soaps or lotion on our hands because that can irritate their skin. Another thing to keep in mind is that worms like to stay moist. So having a water bottle to spray onto the worm or onto your hands in case things dry out is a good idea too. And of course we want to be respectful to the worm, so we're not going to hold on to it for too long, and we won't poke or prod it with our fingers. We'll just use our eyes, maybe a magnifying glass if you have one, to really appreciate them. The first thing I notice about this worm is that it feels kind of slimy. And there's a few reasons for this. Worms live underground and their bodies have some pretty unique features to help them live and move underground. So that sliminess on their skin actually helps them slide through the soil. There's also something else that it does. Remember how worms like to stay moist? Their skin actually has to stay moist because they breathe through their skin. And I have something else to say about the slime too. It's not only helpful for the worms, but it's very rich in nitrogen. And that's an important food for plants. So when the slime sloughs off of their skin, it adds nutrients to the soil, helping plants to grow. All the tunneling that worms do is really helpful as well. It brings oxygen into the soil. And those air spaces that they create allow room for water to flow, for roots to grow, and for soil life to move around. Now, when the worms themselves are moving around, they're eating the organic matter in the soil. So that includes pieces of leaves and plants. It includes tiny bugs, algae, fungus, bacteria. So the worms are constantly eating and defecating and transporting nutrients around. All of that helps to break down the organic matter, and that makes the soil richer and more fertile, and that helps plants to grow. So I feel like we can absolutely say that worms are a gardener's best friend. If you have access to ground and want to encourage worms to take up residence, one thing you could do is to add compost, and also try not to dig into the ground too much. Now, if you're curious what worms are getting up to and we can't see them, here's a neat activity you can try. Worms like to eat leaves. And they'll sometimes poke their heads up onto the surface and grab bits of leaves and take them down into their burrow to have a snack later on. So what we can do is leave leaves on the ground and observe whether they're disappearing over time. So I've done that here. I've laid out some plantain leaves, some garlic mustard, some clover, and a dandelion flower just for fun. Then I took a photo of how it looked to start, and then I covered it with this nice mesh bag from a potato sack so the wind wouldn't blow the leaves away. And I'm going to observe it every day to see if the leaves are disappearing. Now, because science is awesome, you can turn this into an experiment. And I did just that this last week. So I put a setup just like this in the garden, and I did another identical setup in some bare ground. I left the same number of leaves and the same types of leaves, and I covered it up. And my hypothesis, or what I thought would happen, is that the leaves would disappear more quickly in the garden. Because I figured that the garden is a nicer home for worms, so there's probably more of them, and they would eat the leaves more quickly. But that's not what happened at all. They barely touched the leaves in the garden. But in the bare ground, they seem to really like them. And I even got to see a couple worms poking their heads up and burrowing out to get a little munch on the leaves. So what was going on with that? I don't know, maybe because the garden has so much other good stuff in the soil, the worms didn't care at all about the leaves that I laid out nicely for them, but in the bare soil, it was a welcome treat. But this is an experiment that you could try at home. You could compare leaf disappearance in different habitats like I did, or you could lay out different types of leaves and see what the worms prefer. Or you could come up with your whole new idea. Whatever you do, good luck with it, and please let us know what happens. We also use certain kinds of worms to help compost our food scraps. I have a vermi-composting or worm composting system here, which is full of worms called red wigglers. Now, there are thousands of different kinds of worms in the world, and these red wigglers are different from the worms that you would find in a garden or in a yard. They like to eat food scraps. They don't mind living pretty close to each other, and they're kind of red and kind of wiggly, so I guess that's why they're called red wigglers. They don't like light so much, so I won't hold them out for too long. Now, to get this compost system started, we got a bin. We drilled some holes in the bottom. That's for drainage. We drilled some holes on the top. That's for air circulation. And we filled it with shredded paper. Then we buried some food scraps under the paper, and we introduced the red wigglers, and they made themselves right at home. They have been eating the food scraps, eating the paper, having babies, and creating this wonderful compost for us. So basically the worms eat the food scraps, they defecate, and their waste, or castings as it's called, is this very rich, nutrient-filled compost that are great for our gardens. Things that worms like to eat include most fresh fruits and veggies, coffee grounds, tea bags, crushed eggshells. They're not so fond of cooked food or processed foods or things that are very oily or spicy, and they don't like citrus either, apparently. So a little bit discerning in their tastes, but they eat a lot of our waste, and it's best to always bury the food under the shredded paper just to avoid any issues about odor or fruit flies. Now, when it comes time to harvest the compost, what we can do is leave the bin alone for about a week or so, and that way they'll finish up the food scraps that are in there already. You can take a couple piles of this worm-filled compost out, and then we want to separate the worms from the castings. So remember that these worms don't like light, so they will just naturally go to the bottom of the pile, and then you can skim the compost, which doesn't have worms anymore, off the top and use it for your garden plants. If you want that process to go faster, you can shine a light down onto the pile. If any of you want to try this at home, we have a fairly comprehensive guide on designing and building and maintaining a worm composting system in our resources. Now, a couple other things to say about earthworms. Has anybody ever heard that if you cut a worm in half, both halves will survive and you get 2 worms out of it? That is not true at all. Please do not try that. It will not work and you will hurt the worm. Now, one other thing to say, I've caught myself calling these worms guys a couple times, but how the heck can you tell if an earthworm is male or female? Well, it's actually pretty easy because they're all hermaphrodites. That means they're both male and female at the same time. That also means that any adult worm can have babies with any other adult worm, which is pretty handy. When they do reproduce, they leave a little gold cocoon in the bin, and that's filled with eggs, and the eggs hatch and you get little baby worms. And they look just like the adults, only a little bit smaller. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of wondrous worms. Please check out the learning resources on our website where there's more information and more activity resources. We would love to hear from you as always with any questions or observations or feedback that you have. Take good care of yourselves and catch you next time. Bye-bye.